In October 1944, in the freezing rain of France's Vosges mountains, a battalion of Texas National Guardsmen found themselves surrounded on a ridge by roughly 6,000 German troops, cut off from supply, with orders from their own commander to hold their position no matter what happened. The unit sent to rescue them fought through 6 days of some of the most brutal close combat of the entire European campaign, taking losses that, by some counts, actually exceeded the number of men they were sent to save. That rescuing unit was composed almost entirely of Japanese-American soldiers, men whose own families were, in many cases, sitting behind barbed wire in American internment camps at that exact moment. Thousands of miles away from the mountains their sons were fighting and dying in. By the time the war ended, this regiment had become, for its size and length of service, the most decorated unit in the entire history of the United States Army. This is the story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The unit's very existence had to be fought for before it ever fired a shot. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military reclassified Japanese-American men as enemy aliens, barring them from service entirely regardless of citizenship or prior military standing, and a formal 1942 military review board went so far as to recommend against ever allowing them to serve at all, citing what its own report bluntly called the universal distrust in which they were held by the rest of the country. It took direct pressure from within the government itself and, not incidentally, a formal request from a group of Japanese-American college students in Hawaii who had just been stripped of their own ROTC status, writing directly to military authorities that Hawaii was their home and the United States their country, and that they wished to serve it in whatever way they were allowed, before President Franklin Roosevelt personally announced the creation of a segregated Japanese-American combat unit in February 1943, declaring publicly that Americanism was never a matter of race or ancestry. More than 12,000 Nisei men volunteered for a unit that, on paper, existed largely to prove a point the country itself had refused to concede without being forced to. Roughly 2,700 came from Hawaii. Another 1,500 volunteered directly out of the mainland incarceration camps where their own families were being held, choosing to fight for the same government that had imprisoned their parents and siblings without trial or any specific accusation of wrongdoing. They trained for a full year at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, adopting a motto pulled from Hawaiian gambling slang, "Go for broke," a phrase meaning to risk absolutely everything on a single throw, chosen by the men themselves as a fitting description of exactly what they understood they were being asked to do. They joined an existing Nisei unit already in combat, the 100th Infantry Battalion out of Hawaii, which had already earned a grim nickname of its own, the Heart Battalion, after suffering such heavy losses fighting through Italy, including at the grinding, months-long Allied campaign around Monte Cassino, that of the roughly 1,300 men who had originally deployed, barely 500 remained by the spring of 1944. The 100th was folded into the 442nd as its first battalion, retaining its own name and number as a mark of the battles it had already fought before the rest of the regiment ever arrived, a small but meaningful concession to a unit that had already earned its reputation the hardest way possible. The 442nd entered combat as a complete unit in Italy in June 1944, driving German forces north through 10 weeks of mountainous fighting toward the Arno River, distinguishing itself repeatedly enough that by September the regiment was reassigned to support the invasion of southern France, attached to the Texas-based 36th Infantry Division for a push into the Vosges Mountains along the German border, terrain so difficult that, according to local accounts, no army had successfully forced its way through militarily since the days of the Roman Empire. The Nisei soldiers arrived in early October still wearing summer-issue uniforms, utterly unprepared for the bitter, freezing rain that had already settled over the region. Some of them transported to the front in railroad boxcars that still carried the smell of the horses they'd previously hauled, an unintentional, bitter echo of the horse stalls at American assembly centers where many of these same soldiers' families had been temporarily housed before being sent to internment camps further inland. Their first mission in the Vosges was brutal in its own right. liberating the towns of Bruyères and Bifontaine, fighting that required clearing 4 separate hills surrounding Bruyères one at a time against determined German resistance. After 10 straight days of that fighting, the exhausted regiment finally got a single day of rest on October 23rd. Clean clothes, hot food, a chance to simply stop moving for a few hours. It didn't last. The 36th Division's commander, Major General John Dahlquist, had ordered the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, a Texas National Guard unit, to push 4 miles beyond the rest of the American line despite warnings from the battalion's own officers that doing so would leave them dangerously exposed. The warning proved exactly right. Roughly 6,000 fresh German troops surrounded the isolated battalion on 3 sides, cutting off its supply lines entirely and trapping somewhere around 200 men on an isolated ridge that quickly earned the name history remembers it by, the Lost Battalion. Dahlquist turned to the 442nd to get them out. What followed was 6 days of nearly continuous combat through freezing rain, thick mud, mine-laden forest roads, and German positions defended by machine guns, tanks, and artillery deliberately set to burst in the treetops overhead, showering shrapnel down onto anyone caught beneath, a tactic specifically intended to inflict casualties on troops who might otherwise have found shelter simply by lying flat on the ground. The Nisei soldiers were outnumbered by as much as 4 to 1 in places, advancing yard by yard up slopes the Germans had spent days preparing defensively, and in several documented instances resorted to what amounted to suicidal frontal charges, simply to break entrenched German positions blocking their advance when no other tactic seemed likely to work in time. On October 30th, after days of grinding close-range fighting that left companies reduced to a fraction of their starting strength, soldiers of the 442nd's B, I, and K companies finally broke through German lines and made visual contact with the trapped Texans. The first Nisei soldier to actually reach them, a private named Mutt Sakamoto, greeted the men he found with a simple, human gesture that has been retold in nearly every account of the rescue since. He offered them a cigarette, as if the previous 6 days of combat had been nothing more than an inconvenient delay between 2 groups of soldiers meeting for the first time. The cost of that rescue has been repeated so often in one specific form that it's become almost inseparable from the story itself. Roughly 800 casualties suffered by the 442nd to save approximately 200 trapped Texans, a ratio that has understandably shaped most popular retellings of the entire episode. A closer look at the regiment's actual combat records complicates that number somewhat, without changing the fundamental reality of what happened. Historians examining the specific window of the rescue itself, the 6 days between October 26th and 30th, when the 100th and 3rd Battalions carried most of the actual fighting, found losses closer to 36 killed and several hundred wounded, with the commonly cited figure of 800 appearing to combine those direct rescue casualties with the regiment's broader losses across the entire month of October, including the earlier fighting at Bruyères and Bifontaine. Whichever precise number is correct, the deeper point holds regardless. A heavily depleted regiment, having already fought 10 brutal days without rest, absorbed serious losses fighting to save a battalion from another unit entirely at a cost genuinely comparable to, and by some tallies exceeding, the number of men actually rescued. The strain of that mission produced one of the more openly tense moments in the regiment's history. Shortly after the rescue, Dahlquist ordered a formal review formation of the 442nd and reportedly expressed visible displeasure at how few soldiers turned out to stand in ranks. The Nisei officers informed him directly that their numbers were small precisely because of the casualties his own orders had just cost them. It's a moment historians have pointed to ever since in a broader, still debated question about how the 442nd was actually used during the war. Whether the regiment's consistent assignment to some of the most dangerous missions available reflected genuine confidence in its exceptional performance, or something closer to a willingness to treat Nisei soldiers as more expendable than other American troops. The regiment's own combat record, one grueling assignment after another met with success rather than collapse, has generally been read by historians as evidence against the harsher interpretation. But the tension in that exchange with Dahlquist reflects a real, unresolved discomfort that the unit's own veterans carried with them long after the war ended. As one 442nd veteran, Fred Shiosaki, put it years later, describing the entire rescue in 4 words: Americans rescuing Americans. The regiment's service didn't end with the Vosges. In March 1945, the 442nd's own 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, advancing separately into Germany, took part in liberating a subcamp of the Dachau concentration camp system, meaning Japanese-American soldiers, a number of whose own families were still confined behind barbed wire back in the United States at that very moment, helped free Holocaust survivors from behind Nazi Germany's own barbed wire on the other side of the world. The following month, the main body of the 442nd returned to Italy at the personal request of General Mark Clark, where it helped break through the German Gothic Line during the Po Valley campaign, fighting alongside the 92nd Infantry Division, one of the U.S. Army's few black combat units of the war. 2 segregated units placed side by side in the same offensive by an army that, in 1945, still hadn't fully reckoned with the contradiction of fighting a war against fascism abroad with a racially segregated military at home. Private First Class Sadao Munemori, fighting near the town of Saravetsa that April, single-handedly destroyed a German machine gun position. Then, after being forced back into a shell crater with 2 wounded comrades, threw himself on top of a German grenade to save their lives, dying instantly in an act of deliberate self-sacrifice that left the 2 men beside him alive. He remains the only member of the 442nd awarded the Medal of Honor during the war itself, and the date of his death, April 5th, is now observed each year as National Go for Broke Day in his memory, one of the few individual soldiers from the entire regiment whose name is still specifically commemorated on a fixed date every year. By the time the fighting in Europe ended, the combined 100th and 442nd had earned somewhere in the range of 14,000 to 18,000 individual decorations, including thousands of Purple Hearts, more than 24 Distinguished Service Crosses, over 500 Silver Stars, thousands of Bronze Stars, and 7 or 8 separate presidential unit citations, a body of honors that, weighed against the regiment's size and the length of its actual combat service, has never been matched by any other unit in the entire history of the United States Army, a record that has stood for 80 years without a serious challenger. On July 15, 1946, President Harry Truman personally reviewed the regiment on the south lawn of the White House after it marched down Constitution Avenue and delivered a line that has followed the unit ever since, as close to an official verdict on everything it had endured as any American president has ever given a single regiment. "You fought the enemy abroad," he told them, "and prejudice at home, and you won." Only 1 Medal of Honor had actually been awarded to a member of the 442nd during the war itself, a striking gap given the sheer volume of Distinguished Service Crosses and Silver Stars the regiment had already accumulated for actions that, in many cases, later reviewers concluded warranted the nation's highest honor from the very beginning. That changed in 2000 when a broader federal review of racial bias and how valor had been recognized during the Second World War, a review that, in the same period, also finally secured a long-overdue Medal of Honor for the 761st Tank Battalion's Reuben Rivers, a story we've already told on this channel, resulted in 20 additional Nisei soldiers being awarded the Medal of Honor. More than 5 decades after their actions actually took place, most of the recipients by then either elderly or already deceased. Among them was Daniel Inouye, who had lost his right arm in combat with the 442nd in Italy and went on to serve for decades as a United States Senator from Hawaii, carrying the regiment's legacy directly into the halls of the same government that had once classified men like him as enemy aliens. In 2010, Congress approved the Congressional Gold Medal for the 442nd, the 100th Infantry Battalion, and Japanese-American veterans of military intelligence service, presented collectively the following year to a shrinking group of aging survivors and, in many cases, to family members standing in for veterans who hadn't lived to receive it themselves. In 2012, surviving members of the regiment were made Chevaliers of the French Legion of Honor in recognition of what they had done to help liberate a country most of them had never seen before the war sent them there. The 442nd's legacy continues today in the U.S. Army Reserve, the only active infantry formation still carrying its name and its original insignia, one of the last units in the entire Army still permitted to wear it in honor of a regiment that fought 2 wars simultaneously, against an enemy overseas and against the country of its own that had first refused to let it fight at all. If you want to hear the fuller story of the internment camps these soldiers' families were held in while they fought, and the broader Nisei experience of proving loyalty to a country actively imprisoning their own parents, that's a story we're covering in an upcoming video. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next. 2. AI Thumbnail Prompt. Cinematic photorealistic 16:9 image. A small column of World War II-era American soldiers of Japanese descent climbing a steep, muddy forested mountainside in freezing rain, dense fog, and tall pine trees surrounding them. Exhausted posture. Muted, desaturated color grade, deep forest green, charcoal fog, pale, rain-streaked light, documentary realistic, grim and determined. No visible faces close enough to misrepresent a real, identifiable person. Leave clear negative space in the upper third of the frame for bold text overlay.